first thing that we're talking about on the road less traveled to Picard. We're actually going to be talking about, Eric's going to be taking a lead on this one, Star Trek Operation Assimilation. This is a comic book that was published in April of 1997. It was written by Paul Jenkins, who I once upon a time worked with, just very briefly, on a world record attempt comic book at the amazing Arizona Comic Con. Enough about that. The artists on this were Steve Irwin and Terry Pallett. This was actually published by Marvel Comics. This is actually after Marvel Comics managed to wrest the license away from DC, because DC had been publishing most of the Star Trek comics up until that point. Had 26 pages. And then the editor I'm not going to mention because he once upon a time passed over me to ink an issue of Hulk Family with my friend Scott Clark, and I'm still bitter about it. All right, wow. So yeah. Anyhow, Star Trek Operation Assimilation. Now, I did have a hand in picking this particular comic to talk about because I thought it was oddly relevant because, as you can clearly tell, we have a Romulan here who's been turned into a Borg. Considering the obvious connections between the Borg and apparently the Romulans in the new Picard series, while this is probably obviously not canon, I did think it'd be kind of an interesting thing to talk about just to see kind of the ideas that other people have explored in relation to Next Generation, Romulans, and the Borg connections. So tell me, Eric, what did you think about this issue, Star Trek Operation Assimilation?
Well, I had never even heard of this comic book until you brought it to my attention. And I'm really glad that you brought it up because the theme of our main topic here is the road less traveled to Picard, because we're going to talk about some things that we don't think other people are really talking about. We're going to have another show with our lead up to Picard next week. We're going to have special guests, and we're going to really get into some of the big legacy characters like Picard, Data, Seven, some of their sort of the must-reads, the must-watch stories, whether it be books, comics, television shows. But we figured nobody was really going to talk about this stuff. So we were like, this was I think a great piece of content in that vein. So Operation Assimilation, I'll just sort of break it down, is basically the story of a Romulan commander who has been sent to a world where there was a recent revolt. And so it's basically a Romulan colony. And it's kind of interesting because it actually kind of ties into Picard Countdown. Because what has happened is that basically there's this Romulan colony with an indigenous population, and they have revolted. And so she comes in as a commander of actually a very weak ship. It's basically like a Romulan scout ship. You know, if you remember the Romulan scout ship from the Next Gen era, right. That's basically what her ship is. In fact, they even say she doesn't even have a cloaking device. But she's kind of the kind of picture you're getting is that she's basically like in the outer rim territories of the Romulan Empire, you know, cruising around. And there's been this revolt. So she's been sent to quash it, which she does. She quashes this revolt. She actually apparently kills the Romulan governor because she holds him responsible for the revolt, and does her business and leaves. But I found that really interesting. That's the intro to the story, and that actually ties in kind of to Picard Countdown, the recent Picard Countdown comic, because they have a very similar situation going on of a indigenous population on a Romulan colony that's revolted. So it's neat to me to see that this idea was already out there. And this comic, of course, was made in the First Contact era, you know, around the time that First Contact came out. It was kind of a tie-in to First Contact. So
and it tied into or referenced Neutral Zone, didn't it? Star Trek Next Generation Neutral Zone.
Well, absolutely, yeah. So as the story progresses, the Romulan commander is out, doing her patrol, and they realize that some unidentified ship is entering Romulan space. Again, it seems like she's sort of like on the border. She's like a scout craft. She's just cruising around in the outer rim of the Romulan Empire again, if you will. And they realize, we realize because we know more than them, the ship that they've detected is a Borg cube. Now, one of the cool things about this this comic book, and it relates actually very well to the Picard Countdown comic book, is this character is extremely arrogant an extremely like racist, just like Romulan, very dedicated to the Romulan Empire, and just looks at herself and her culture as being superior to all others, including the Federation and the Klingons. And so when she first encounters this Borg cube, even though she's sitting in a Romulan scout vessel, she's not worried. And of course, we know better, because it's like, okay, I've seen the Romulan scout vessel before, and he's like, and we're talking about a Borg cube here. So we know things are not going to go well for this character. But in her mind, she's not even worried, because she feels that the Romulans are superior to everything, and it's not going to be a problem. She's actually kind of upset because she feels that she should be on a full warbird. She should have a higher status. She's kind of lamenting the status that she's on, that she's having to deal with these backwater worlds, if you will. So she thinks that the Borg are going to be no problem. And when they first kind of encounter the Borg, it's very similar to what happens in Q Who. I want to say Q Who in that episode, when the Enterprise first encounters the Borg. It's a very similar thing that happens with them. The Borg initially put their tractor beam onto the ship. The Romulans fire their weapons, which damages the Borg cube, and they stop the initial attack. But then, of course, what happens is the Borg ship heals itself. Once she sees that, she starts to realize she's in trouble, because she's never seen that before. She's never seen a ship heal itself, and she realizes that she might be outclassed. But because of her Romulan arrogance, she continues the conflict. And it's kind of interesting, because they actually show the Romulans are obviously very aggressive and relentless themselves, but it kind of shows how the Borg overwhelm them as they're basically fighting on the ship and everything like that. It's a pretty neat story. So the way that it ends up is that the Romulan commander, of course, is absorbed, and they actually go through the process of her absorption as she's losing her memories and all that kind of stuff, and losing her individuality, and then she becomes a Borg. And then basically the last scene is now a full Romulan warbird, okay, coming across this cube, and now of course the spokesperson is her, the commander. She's been absorbed, and of course that means she has all of the knowledge of the Romulan Empire, and they're about to get blown to smithereens. So it was a really a good book. I thought it was really interesting, and it's kind of funny because it ties in very well to the Star Trek Countdown comic book. It has a lot of the same themes, all that kind of stuff. Obviously, this is really supposed to be the first contact of the Romulans with the Borg, and the first assimilation of the Romulans by the Borg. And the idea that this character that we see on the cover here, she was this sort of obscure Romulan commander, and she became kind of the locutus, if you will, for the Romulans, for the Borg to be able to chop them up. And of course, that leads us to the TNG episode that we reviewed last week, which is Neutral Zone, where we find out, yes, indeed, the Borg have been destroying Romulan outposts along the border of the Neutral Zone.
Yeah, it was interesting because we were talking about looking for, something interesting to lead up to Picard, because everyone's leading up to Picard, but we wanted to find some content that could be uniquely ours, that not many people are going to be talking about. And when we were talking about it, I really wanted to do some more comic book stuff, because I like having comic book stuff, focused and kind of featured for the show, for my own personal, proclivity or whatever. And it was interesting because when I was going through stuff looking for something, my initial thought was I thought we would actually talk about, it's actually for the DC Comics series, or was a two-parter, again, focusing on the Romulans. But this would have actually been the Red Tunic, motion picture, Enterprise crew era. And it was actually a story that involved Saavik, and actually reintroduced the character of Zahn, who was actually going to be a Star Trek Phase 2 character. We talked about Phase 2 when we did our actual retrospective review of Star Trek the Motion Picture on its anniversary. And so I was originally thinking we would lean towards that, because that story has a lot to do with the Romulans in terms of like how they've always been portrayed a very certain way. And in that one, what they're actually doing is they're actually experimenting on Vulcans. They find some Vulcans and they basically trap them, and they're trying to find a way to, through study and kind of torture, actually weaponize the Vulcans' mental abilities in terms of like, like the mind melts and stuff, and finding ways to actually weaponize that. And so I was originally thinking that was probably what we are going to look at doing. And as I was going through kind of the archives and finding and looking for something, I just kind of stumbled across this. The cover was what initially caught my attention. And I was like, wow, this is crazy. There was a Star Trek comic book that specifically involved the Romulans and the Borg. Like dead on, no blinking, flinching, just dead on, Romulan Borg, here's the story. And I was like, wow, this is like tailor-made to talk about in the lead up for Picard. So it's a very interesting thing to find. It's curious that there's a lot of information about it on the internet, but I've been surprised that no one's been really kind of looking at this. And so I think this is something kind of unique just for our show. And I greatly appreciate you going along with my wanting to continue to cover comics, content, even though obviously Countdown directly relates to Picard. This is just an interesting artifact that people were already curious about, what could have possibly happened, between the Romulans and the Borg in the next gen era. I just found it to be just terribly, terribly interesting.
Yeah, I really appreciated this recommend, because I read it in a digital version, and I'm going to seek the physical copy because for one thing, I love the cover, and I'm a physical copy person, but I liked the story enough. It was intriguing enough to me that I definitely want to add this to my collection. I thought it was a really intriguing comic, and it's not going to be contradicted in Picard. I can guarantee you that almost. I don't think they're going to get into the quote unquote first contact of the Romulans and the Borg. They might, but I don't think they will. I think it'll be kind of mysterious. And this is basically the story of how that happened. And again, I think it's really interesting how the events in this book do tie in terms of the theme, in terms of some of the plotting, almost directly into what we see in Star Trek Picard, Star Trek Picard Countdown, the Countdown comic book, because we don't really see the Romulans interacting with their constituent planets very much.
Right.
We saw a little bit, obviously, in Nemesis with the Remans, but up to that point, we really never heard anything about how does the Romulan Empire work. There's kind of this weird assumption almost that they're just a bunch of colonies, meaning that they just spread out among the universe. And I was always like, well, they're an empire. That's not how empires colonize. Empires colonize places where people are already at, and they exploit them and they take them over. And that, to me, it was something intriguing in Star Trek Countdown. And they have the same premise in this book, which is that she's basically dealing with a revolt in one of these sort of outer colonies, if you will. But they have a native population, and it's a native population that's been giving them problems. So, and she's just brutal. She's just completely arrogant, as far as that they're just like subhuman, very much like in the Star Trek Countdown comic book. It's the same attitude. So I thought that to me was intriguing. It almost makes you wonder if somebody at IDW or something, or somebody in terms of this some sort of story group at CBS kind of threw that out there, and said, hey, well, there was this comic book where they did this, and they were kind of like, maybe we could use that, So I think it actually relates very well. It's a kind of a nice complementary piece to the current Star Trek Picard Countdown comic book. And then also what's interesting is this is a First Contact era book. So they have a nice little interview with Jonathan Frakes about the making of First Contact, which was big news at the time. That was the first feature film that Jonathan Frakes had directed. So they have a nice little interview with him. And they have a nice history of the Borg, where they basically go through the history of the Borg from Neutral Zone, and they do reference Neutral Zone all the way until, I think, First Contact. So even though Voyager had started by this time, Voyager had not had any Borg episodes yet. So there's nothing about the the Borg in Voyager, but they get all the way up to First Contact and talk about the Borg Queen and all that stuff. And it's a nice little history. So even from that perspective, it's kind of a very useful in terms of just if you're not that familiar with the history of the Borg, there's a nice little write-up like at the end of this book. It's like 2 or 3 pages where they just go through everything up to that point, up to First Contact. And that's, to me, when the Borg were really cool, too. It's just like, I kind of wanted to give a shout out because you don't hear too much about this particular Star Trek creator. And here we go. All right. This is the man who created the Borg. This is the man that is responsible for the Borg. Not necessarily as we know them today, especially in light of Voyager and the circumstances that they apparently are in Star Trek Picard, but this is the original creator of the Borg. And he's sort of a controversial figure in Trek history. His name is Maurice Hurley. And Maurice Hurley was basically one of the first showrunners for the first 2 seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation. And if you've ever seen the documentary Chaos on the Bridge, he's actually featured very prominently in that. And they address many of the controversies of his tenure on that documentary. I think that's a really good documentary if anybody's interested in the early days of Star Trek The Next Generation. And the thing that I always thought was so cool is that the original premise that he came up with was very simple. He wanted to have an enemy that was unbeatable. And unfortunately, Trek kind of got away from that. But the original attitude, the original idea there was very powerful. You know, it reminds me of the whole thing with Q and Picard admitting he was out of his league. He was out of his depth. You know what I mean?
Right.
And you just don't see that anymore. You just don't see that anymore in anything. It's to have the hero basically say, yeah, I can't beat these guys. And then, of course, the best of both worlds, which is a classic, beyond classic. And it all leads up to that. And Picard himself becoming assimilated. But I just wanted to give some shout outs to the creator of the Borg and the fact that I know he is somewhat of a controversial person in Trek. This is the man who fired Gates McFadden. He did all sorts of other things that are considered very controversial, but this is the guy who created the Borg. And if it wasn't for him, we would have no Borg. And so he's very relevant to the stories that we're talking about today.
Cool. So for our second thing that we wanted to talk about here on the road less traveled to Picard, we were going to talk about the Star Trek Next Generation episode Tapestry. Let me pull up the graphic here. So I've got a graphic there on the screen. Eric and I are both big fans of the Red Tunic era, or the motion picture era for Star Trek. So it's kind of fun to see Captain Picard in the classic Red Tunic era, the more Napoleonic kind of look. So Tapestry was, of course, important episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. It's one of my personal favorites. It was in season 6. It aired on February 15th, 1993. It was actually written by Ronald D. Moore, probably, in my opinion, one of the better writers that we've had in Trek of the newer stuff for sure. And then the director was Les Landau. This episode, I remember seeing it on television and was thoroughly kind of surprised at it because it starts off with Picard essentially looking as if he's just died. And then obviously he passes to the afterlife where Q is basically waiting for him and basically kind of states that, you know what, you're going to basically travel with me from now on since you're dead. And we learn an awful lot about how Picard was actually right out of the academy. We learn about the incident that caused him to have basically a device that replaces his heart, because his heart was actually stabbed and pierced by a Nausicaan blade. We kind of see some of his classmates or shipmates, as it were, from the academy, and kind of just learn an interesting thing about who Picard was in his early days. He and kind of a we'll call it a what's the name of that movie? The classic movie where the guy gets to go back and change. Why am I blanking on it? It's a Wonderful Life. So the story unfolds kind of like It's a Wonderful Life, in that Q grants Picard's wish to kind of go back in time and actually fix what he believes are these personal defects in his personality and the choices that he made as a young man. And then we literally see, as Picard states in the episode, he pulls on those strands in that tapestry and unravels, the tapestry of his life, which is where the name of the show comes from. It's a very interesting show because I felt like it's a very interesting examination of Picard as a character and how he feels about mistakes, particularly because I'm curious to see how this is going to be reflected in Picard, because based off the trailers for Picard, we're going to see him in a similar place where he regrets decisions that he's made. And I'm curious to see if he learned the lesson that Q was trying to teach him, or if he didn't learn the lesson that Q was trying to help teach him. So we'll see how it kind of unfolds. So tell me, Eric, what are your feelings about the episode Tapestry?
I've always really enjoyed this particular episode. I remember it was really interesting because this is one of the few Star Trek Next Generation episodes that has anything to do with any kind of religious or supernatural or spiritual themes, because for the most part, the Next Generation stayed away from that kind of stuff. I remember my dad commenting on that we thought that was kind of interesting. This whole idea that Q was some sort of god, and that he was interacting with Picard's spirit,
Right.
That was pretty interesting. And of course, they leave it open ended because we don't know. They even say at the end, was that really Q, or was that just a delusion in Picard's mind? Of him working through this whole process in his head, and they left it open ended, which I like. So it was open to interpretation about what actually happened. So yeah, it's one of my. I don't know if it's exactly in my top 10, but it's definitely one of those. As far as like Picard episodes, it's probably one of my top 10. It's a very good episode. We get a lot of background on Picard. We did hear earlier about how this happened. There was a previous episode where Picard is going to get a new heart. That's in the second season, and he's talking to Wesley, because him and Wesley are actually traveling together, and he tells Wesley the story of how he ended up with an artificial heart. And so that's also nice because this is kind of a follow-up to that. And you didn't really get a lot of that in Next Generation, where you had, some sort of a kernel of an idea in a previous episode, and then they actually expound on it on a later episode, So
Right.
I like that too. It's unique in that respect because obviously Star Trek: The Next Generation is very, episodic in nature. It's not serialized. But that's one of those examples of where they took something that was established all the way back in the second season. And I believe this is in the last season of Star Trek. So it's kind of neat that they came back to this idea and said, hey, let's do a little bit more about this. Because remember, Picard is the kind of guy that, he would regret a decision like that, because Picard is a very different person than he was when he was young. And we see that in this episode, that Picard in his youth was a hellraiser. He was very undisciplined. And it's kind of neat to see that there was some sort of progression with Picard, that he wasn't always the way that he was. He used to be a very reckless person, very reckless, young officer. And it's completely different than what he is in the series. In the series, he's probably one of the most disciplined people on the show. In fact, there's, in the episode of, Unification with Spock, there's that moment where Spock actually says there's a very Vulcan quality to to Picard. And I agree. There's a
Right.
very Vulcan quality to Picard. He's probably the most rational, disciplined human that you see in the Star Trek universe. And to see that he used to not be that way, I think it's fun. It's a lot of fun to see the way that he used to be. And he used to be a womanizer, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And of course now it's like he hardly even has a girlfriend, you know. But
Right.
back in the day, he was out there carousing. He was getting into fights with Nausicaans, you know, all sorts of different things. And then of course the overall message of this episode I think is really good. The tapestry of our lives as it goes, and the idea, because so many of us I think have legitimate issues in our lives that we wish we could do over, that we wish we could get rid of, or we wish we could do over. And we really don't know what kind of effect it would have on the rest of our life. Interestingly enough, I think the Orville kind of hit on this, right? The Orville kind of hit on this idea of the tapestry of our lives, because in the Orville, they had an episode where it turned out that the captain and the first officer had never gotten together. Do you remember that? That's like at the end of the second season. Have you seen that episode?
Yeah, it's a great that's a great episode.
So what of course happens is, and you know, this is just a little bit of a spoiler because I won't say what happens at the end of the episode, but the setup is that the captain and the first officer were never married. They never went out with each other, and it like destroyed the entire universe basically. I mean, it was like it had that effect. In this particular episode, what Q does is he takes away the element of, like, for instance, what would have happened if Picard wasn't at you know, the battle for Earth with the Borg and all that kind of stuff. He kind of takes that away and says, I'm not going to allow history to be changed at all because Q has that power, but your life will change. That's it, you know? So that he kind of took that off the table of the bigger ramifications of Picard's life going a different way. And the state that Picard is in, you know, after the change is pretty funny and humiliating. You know, I call him boring Picard. You know, the Picard in the blue suit.
Right.
I think that was pretty funny that he's a lieutenant junior grade. He's like an assistant in the I don't know, what was it, like I
think it was like astrophysics or something like that.
Yeah. He is obviously in the science division. And he's just basically, you can see him. He's just like probably just like doing data collection, you know, like he's just like absolutely nobody on the ship, you know. And to be a lieutenant junior grade when Picard is obviously, you know, obviously over 50 years old, and that's pretty bad to be lieutenant junior grade, you know.
Well, I personally, I've always loved this episode. It's one of my favorite episodes of The Next Generation. I always find this episode to be very reflective. I think that's why I enjoy it so much, is because I think, like you said, all of us have those moments in our lives when we think, you know, maybe I should have turned left instead of turning right, you know, when you come to that fork in a road. And you always wonder, you know, if I'd done this instead of this other thing, you know, how would things have turned out? Would things genuinely be better, or would they be worse? And the lesson to take away from this episode is pretty clear. And I think it still resonates. And in that sense, it reminds me of like a classic, you know, original series episode. And then it takes sort of like this kind of moral premise, or this concept of, you know, the choices that we make and how it affects ourselves and others. Yeah, I just thought this would be, again, we had discussed it and we both agreed this would be a fun episode to talk about because of how it specifically relates to Picard. And I'm really curious to see in the new show that'll be starting soon, if he still has learned the lessons, you know, from this particular episode, or if he's still, you know, I think as all of us do at some point in our lives, you know, questioning, you know, I should have done this or I shouldn't have done that. Maybe things would be different. Maybe things would be better. So I think those ideas are universal and constant. But this is just, like I said, one of my personal favorite episodes. Great performances by everyone all the way around. I quite like the fight choreography of Picard fighting the Nausicaans. and kind of how that plays out. Again, it reminds me of an original series. You can see Kirk, fighting that way. It's the most, I think, in a way, with Picard specifically, I think it's the most Kirk we ever see him is in this particular episode. And that's kind of fun to see him in that role, being sort of the bare knuckles, kind of captain, carousing around. And it's just kind of fun to see Picard in that role. And the disdain with which he looks at it now, as an older man, looking back on the mistakes of his youth, as it were. So I personally feel like this is an episode definitely worth revisiting before watching Picard, because I think in its own way, it is going to be relatable, and I'm just really curious to see if Picard's learned the lessons from this particular episode.
That's a great point you bring up, because in a lot of ways, I feel like this episode is actually going to be a mirror image of Star Trek Picard. The Picard of Star Trek Picard, I think, absolutely has forgotten this lesson. I think that he regrets what happened during the evacuation of Romulus. That he regrets perhaps a lot of things in his life, but most certainly there's some sort of trauma that got Picard out of Starfleet, and I don't know if he would do things differently if he had the chance. But that's kind of the feeling I get when I'm watching the trailers for Star Trek Picard, is that he definitely is a man full of regret. So I think in a lot of ways, this episode is actually going to be a mirror image of what we get in Star Trek Picard.
Cool. That's an interesting observation. So I think with this that we're probably pretty good for this episode. Do you have anything else that you would like to add?
I have one more little shout out, which is also related to a little personal story that I did talk about in one of our previous episodes back when we were doing the podcast. The actor that plays young Picard is Marcus Nash, and I did meet Marcus at Star Trek Las Vegas. He's a very cool guy. He actually came up to our table when we were at Quarks, and he was going to all sorts of tables, and he was telling everybody that was actually his first Star Trek convention, this last one in August. And he came by. He was very nice. He introduced himself. Obviously, he looks different. He's got a beard. This picture here is pretty much the way that he looks now. So he didn't quite. He was, people weren't going to know who he was by looking at him. So, right. But he did. Obviously, this man played Picard. This is a man who actually got to play Picard. So this is pretty cool. And I did get to meet him. And he was a very pleasant man. I just wanted to give him a shout out and talk about how I appreciate that. Not very few of the actors do that. Aaron Eisenberg was one of the actors that would do that, would go to Quarks and go to basically every table and say hi, which is just so cool. That's one of the special things about Quarks at the Star Trek Vegas. And Marcus did that as well. And I really appreciated it. He's a very nice person. I believe that he was actually promoting a film that he had directed. It says here that he is a writer and director known for Little Rituals. I can't remember if that was the film that he was talking about, but I know that he was talking about that he's kind of moved on into independent film and things like that. So I just wanted to give him a shout out. He is an actor who actually played Jean-Luc Picard.
Very cool. All right, so I think with that, we're probably good. So I want to do one more quick shout out here as we wrap up the episode. Definitely, if you're not familiar with Red Skirts, definitely visit redskirtsonline.com. That's the webcomic that I do with my friend Al Sparrow. If you like Star Trek, I think you'll really enjoy Red Skirts. It's a kind of a Star Trek parody, but as I stated earlier, it's more of a love letter to all the science fiction TV show and movies that a lot of us, hopefully, if you're of a certain age, you grew up watching and enjoying. Things from the 60s, the 70s, 80s, and a little bit of inspiration even from the 90s. So definitely check that out. We have a new page that's up. 2020 is going to be a big year for Red Skirts as we move forward, as we return to doing regular updates, as well as basically launching into a totally brand new story and continue to explore every corner of the Red Skirts universe. So I hope you'll definitely go over there and check out redskirtsonline.com today.